Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Carol, you know I was out in Colorado. I was biking last month with my dad. I went all over the state. I saw in some situations neighbors dueling with each other when it came to political signs. Across the street, next door, neighbors literally calling each other out depending on where I was a few times. It was kind of funny out there. But it reminded me of the deep divide that we see in the American political landscape. Not that I need to be reminded of it because out there in the media, it's there each and every day.
Right.
It's not just our imaginations, though. A report from the Pew Research Center this summer said, quote, Republicans and Democrats are more divided along ideological lines, and partisan antipathy is deeper and more extensive than at any point in the last 2 decades.
Well, we feel it, right? We talk about it constantly, this division that we're seeing, whether it's across party lines or elsewhere.
Oftentimes, folks out there use division and the word tribes to sort of describe division. It's often looked at in a pejorative way, just another thing that kind of pushes us apart and it makes us separate from one another. Yet Michael Morris argues in a new book that perhaps rather paradoxically, what keeps us apart can actually bring us closer together.
Kind of love that idea.
Michael Morris is professor of leadership at Columbia Business School. His new book is out today, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. He joins us from New York.
Michael, so great to have you here with us. So relevant in terms of here we are in an election year. So talk to us a little bit about, first of all, that this just kind of general concept of what divides us can bring us together. Why did you think you needed to write this book and bring it to people?
Well, thank you for having me. This is a book that I've been working on for almost 10 years. I'm a behavioral scientist, a research psychologist, and my specialty is cultural psychology, which is the study of the cultural frames in our heads that guide our thinking, guide our actions and decisions, and what activates them and how they change. And I've been teaching at top business schools for decades, at Columbia Business School, formerly at Stanford Business School. So I've developed a toolkit for thinking about how to use the cultural forces that shape people's thinking to create unity in a group or to create change in a society or in an organization. And that's the reason that I started writing this book, sort of to create a playbook for activists, leaders, managers, high school teachers, coaches, anybody who has to orchestrate a group into, a productive direction.
Well, and what's interesting is you hear the word tribe or tribalism, and you might get a little, maybe put off a little bit or think one way. But you say, when we think of tribes, it's countries, it's churches, it's political parties, it's companies, it could be families, right? Like it's groups that we deal with all the time.
Yeah, tribes, from an evolutionary standpoint or from a, classic anthropology standpoint, it just refers to the distinctively human form of social organization, which is large communities that are united by shared culture, as opposed to being united by blood relations or being united by, dyadic bonds between people. And that's how we differ from other primates. You could never have a chimpanzee Manhattan. Once they get more than 50 individuals in a group, it starts to break apart because they depend on either being related or having a direct personal bond of trust. We can trust total strangers because we share culture with them, so we can understand them and we can predict their movements and we can predict what they will do, so we can trust them. So yeah, tribalism is mostly a good thing. It's what made us human. It's what got us where we are. Now, I think what's really interesting is, over the past 10 years, while I've been writing this book, there's been kind of a trope of toxic tribalism that has emerged among the pundit class and has been picked up by politicians and business leaders. And the idea is that somehow a deeply evolved drive to hate each other has somehow reawakened. And now we're screwed because we don't talk to each other anymore, and there's no way to get the genie back into the bottle anymore. And this makes for colorful articles, and maybe it makes for riveting speeches, but it's a kind of despairing, fatalistic take on the conflicts of our time. I don't think it's a helpful way to think, and I don't think it's an accurate way to think. It's not a way of talking about tribal instincts that any evolutionary scholar or any behavioral scientist would recognize. So I think we've kind of talked ourselves into this take on tribalism that's not scientifically founded and not helpful.
Would you dispute the idea?
The purpose of the book is to try to debunk that way of thinking about tribalism.
Well, Professor Morris, would you dispute the idea that we're more divided now, like the Pew Research says, than we are, at least politically, and than we have been in previous decades for the last 20 years? Does that seem like it's not necessarily accurate to you?
Well, perhaps in the last 20 years, but certainly not the claim that I hear more often, which is that the American people have never been this divided. If you read history, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln became president. He had less than 40% of the popular vote. 7 states seceded before he was even inaugurated. The Civil War breaks out a few weeks afterwards. 4 more states secede. Now that's a crisis.
That's divided.
That's a legitimacy crisis for a president, and that's a big rift to heal. But Lincoln was one of the leaders, and there are many throughout history, political and business leaders, who they had faith that the best way to heal a divide was tribal memory. It was appealing to our common ancestors, appealing to our common past. Lincoln had that famous mysterious line in his first inauguration that the mystic chords of memory shall yet swell the chorus of the Union. What was he talking about? Well, he thought of himself as storyteller in chief, and he made all of these wonderful speeches like the Gettysburg Address that made reference to the sacrifices of our common ancestors and the common ideals that even people in the South were moved by that speech. One holiday we have coming up is Thanksgiving, and we often associate Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, but it was really Abraham Lincoln who started Thanksgiving as a national holiday, and he did it because he thought that we needed a national ritual of gratitude and memory, and that more than anything else could bring people together. So we may think of nostalgia and sentimentality about the past as a silly, irrational way of thinking, but it's a deep part of our tribal wiring, and one that can be used for inclusiveness, not just for divisiveness. We see a brand of populist politics nowadays where the story is, things used to be great, but now we have all these immigrants and things are going to hell. Well, that's a divisive form of populism, but there have been many leaders who practiced inclusive forms of populism. And I think, we need to understand tribalism and understand all the ways that we can use it at a time like this.
Well, when we come back, we want to continue. We have to do a little bit of news, but we want to come back with you, Professor Morris, and continue this conversation. And because you've also advised political campaigns that we know, whether it was Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, we want to dig a little bit more deeper into politics, but also maybe tools that we can all use so that when we have kind of the division aspect of our society out there, maybe how we can get to a better place that actually brings us together, what we can all do to get to that point.
Also, full disclosure, Professor Morris was my professor at business school. As I was doing research and saw his name for this segment, I was, oh yeah, my first class in business school.
We're gonna have
Professor
to find
Morris.
out.
It's an intensive sort of social psychology class that you take, for 2.5 weeks? Is that right?
Professor
Roughly
Morris,
2.5 weeks?
maybe you can go in your files and check out what grade Tim got. We can
grade non-disclosure is a great thing about business school.
Professor Morris, Michael Morris, Professor of Leadership at Columbia Business School. We're going to come back. We're talking about his book, Tribal, How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. More to come on the other side. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec. As we mentioned, we're talking with Michael Morris, professor of leadership at the Columbia Business School. We're talking about his new book, Tribal, how the cultural instincts that divide us can help bring us together. And at the beginning of the book, he notes that he has advised political campaigns about culture-relevant policies and messaging, and that included the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, also Joe Biden, which made us want to ask him about kind of that political environment. We've talked about politics already a little bit, but I do wonder, I don't know, do campaigns want to hear about culture relevant policies with everything that's going on? How do they think about messaging and getting to people who, in a world where it's like you're either in one camp or the other, and you don't necessarily want to hear about the other camp?
Well, I think, we're in for a treat tonight in this debate between two, very articulate, talented communicators. And I happen to be part of a team advising one of the sides of the debate. And I think that there are really important issues related to tribal identities that sides have to work on. For example, Kamala Harris is a person who has multiple social identities, and she's been sort of lambasted by Trump, I don't think very effectively, for claiming to be, both African American and South Asian American. And I think that what she has to do and has to do well is code switching of, showing an African American audience that she understands them and that they can trust her, and showing a legal audience that she's as tough a prosecutor as any, and showing other audiences that she connects with them. She has a Jewish husband. She was raised by a Indian American mother, so she's a person who can have a legitimate, authentic connection with a really broad swath of the society. Now, Tim Walz is a perfect complement to her. I've heard him described as an REI candidate. He's the only candidate who looks like he's actually been camping in his life. That you could go fishing with him and he would know how to bait a hook. And I think he needs to leverage that. He needs to show people that he knows how to fix a car. He could help you jump your battery on a cold winter night. He's that kind of guy, and there are relatively few of them in the elite levels of politics, and I think he has to show that to us. One of the things that's not talked about so much is that there's a huge gender discrepancy in support for the two sides. Young men are 12% less likely to support Harris-Walz than women, and among young men, it's even sharper. And it could really make a difference in some of the swing states like Arizona. So I think Tim has to, he has to step up and show that he's Coach Walz, and he can be kind of a man's man tonight in the way that. Sorry?
No, this is fascinating. I guess I want to ask you about what's going on in our culture where so many younger white men are pretty angry and feel left behind. What's happened?
Well, they used to have a not automatic, but a relatively easy path to success and social standing because they were from the favored group, the group that was sort of the prototype of who should have positions of power and responsibility and affluence. And that is declining. It's certainly not over, but it's diminishing. And so they feel like people are cutting ahead in line. People are taking the places that should be theirs. And, it's not completely new. I mean, there's been resentments about affirmative action for decades, but I think now it's not just affirmative action. It's that we've had waves of very talented immigrants coming into the country, for the past 20 years. And that means that a lot of our, native born white male good old boys are not, are not getting those promotions. It's Russians and, Brazilians and, Nigerians who are getting those promotions, and not necessarily because of any DEI policies, just because we have so many talented people from all around the world who've arrived.
Have you seen anecdotally that show up in your business school classes in the decades that you've been teaching? Have they become more diverse?
Very much so. The MBA population compared to when you were in it has changed dramatically.
Wow.
I had a class last spring, a class of 50 people, and I had 7 Nigerian students. Some of them Nigerian Americans, but they were all, students who were Nigerian, by identity. And that's, Nigeria is one of the most populous countries in the world, so we shouldn't be surprised. But it wasn't the case when you were in the business school classroom. We weren't recruiting from Africa, right, and the African diaspora in the same way.
Hey,
and it's good for the world that we are.
Listen, we've just got about, Professor Morse, about a minute left. Your advice to folks where we see so much division, but you say in your book it can bring us together. What are tools we can do? Piece of advice. Again, we've only got about a minute left.
Well, what we need to do is understand what tribal psychology really is. And there are 3 parts to it, what I call the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the ancestor instinct. The idea that we're driven to kind of imitate our peer group, we're driven to emulate our heroes, and we're driven to perpetuate the ways of our ancestors and maintain traditions. And all of those things can be positive forces for unity. And what we need to do is understand the levers for invoking these forces. They're inside every person, but there are triggers that bring them to the fore that are invisible to us because they operate unconsciously. And so I've tried to, explain what we've learned from lots of research about what those triggers are that a teacher or a manager or a politician can use. And then over the longer term,
right,
cultures are malleable, and we have to understand what are the signals that we can send to help evolve the culture. Culture is not a fixed thing that we're stuck with. It's something that we can mold.
That's a great way to wrap it up. Michael Morse, thank you so much, of Columbia Business School. His new book out today, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek.